But surely the fish will come back again one day, won't they, Dad?
I don't think so. Extinct means dead, just like the dinosaurs.
See, that was what the world, the oceans be like in 2050. It's obviously a prediction. And we'll be looking at, in a moment, at some of the issues that might lead us to that state of affairs and what's necessary in order to avoid that. But before we start that, is there anything anyone likes to say about their reaction to those films?
Can I put a point though? Both those videos made the point that that the seas were going to be emptied by 2050, and if you look at fisheries that are being sustainably managed, that is increasing and increasing all the time. So isn't the picture actually that more and more fisheries are going towards sustainable, and even the picture in, say, the North Sea has improved from 2012 to maybe to now in terms of a lot of fish stocks. So isn't there a place that we just need to get better at managing the fish stocks and fishing them sustainably, rather than saying, no, we mustn't exploit the sea?
Yes, off you go.
The impacts, of course, we've had on the seas, what steps we put in place, or is it, instead of putting steps in place, would it literally be better just to stop all fishing commercially in the seas? Because what we're doing is we're damaging so far, and even when I'm watching that video, I'm thinking, what are we going to do about this? Because it's all well putting quotas on, but they're still going to be broken, fish are still going to be damaged, ecosystems are still being damaged. What is there we can do?
Okay. Does anyone else want to put in their thoughts at this point?
Yeah, I agree with that you sort of have to take into account economics as well, like when you're thinking about quotas and how stopping fishing would affect the economies.
So the economic consequences of taking the action. Yeah.
And there's billions of people on the planet that rely on fish for their protein, so we have.
It's a vital food source, exactly.
But there are plenty of other sources of protein, tons. There are. It's well known and documented now that you don't need to eat fish for protein.
Yeah, but I mean, look at haddock. I mean, the 1880 stock size, 7% decline must be within this.
This is in your seminar notes. Right?
It must be within your
it's on our
error.
PowerPoint. I think it's slide 4. Actually.
Yeah. It must be within the realms of error, because estimating stocks in 1880 has got to be. I mean, you've got the link for your thing, but that's got to be within the realms of error. That would say that haddock has been probably pretty much stable from 1880 to 2010. I don't know how much haddock is eaten. That 7% is definite. Must be within your experimental error.
Yes, these are figures which compare the 1880 stock with the 2010 stock. They're taken from government figures, UK government's Centre for Environment and Aquaculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, CFAS. And there are obviously, as you point out, there's a fair degree of error in these things, but the important thing is to be able to see the trend that's going on.
But the trend in haddock is good, basically. That to me, that said there is no real change between 1880 and 2010.
In that stock, yes.
In that stock.
But what about the other stocks?
Well, but that's one point. But the point is in haddock, that's a sustainable fishery.
That is being fished
surely when the
sustainably,
others
yes.
go, you say inevitably will, then haddock's gone
Well,
by default.
I mean, you would think it would, but
Exactly.
if that's all gone down by that much and haddock's remained.
Because if you take everything else away and you just leave haddock won't last long.
But they've been taken.
I get your point there,
Looking
it's
at
not
that,
changed much.
looking at that, if you look at those figures, there's a huge decline in other fish stock, but haddock are remaining stable.
But then, if the other fish stock disappears...
But I mean, you're looking at that and you say that's almost disappeared.
Hmm?
That's saying that stocks in other species have almost disappeared.
Yeah, so when they do
But-
ultimately, surely haddock ain't going to be there.
But
Inevitably,
that's
one
not
day
the
they'll be
trend.
gone.
But that's not the trend haddock's showing, is it? It's haddock showing that
Yeah.
it's okay.
At the moment.
It's stable with a huge decline.
Yeah, but that's stable currently.
Yeah.
When they go, it ain't no longer.
But I think
that's no longer the picture, is it? So
But
currently
you
it
would
might
surely,
be
if
better,
that was
won't
the
it?
case, you would expect, wouldn't you? You would expect that haddock would be reducing similarly in line with like herring
Yeah,
being
so-
smashed.
yeah, I get.
But I
that.
mean, also you're thinking
But
if
clearly-
you got rid of most of, I guess, the cod and stuff, they compete with herring and with haddock to some extent. So getting rid of other species, it doesn't make haddock an unsustainable fishery. Haddock is a sustainable fishery, and you should surely look at the reasons haddock is sustainable and try and bring that into your other fisheries, as opposed to saying stop fishing, because haddock is obviously a success story.
But also that data is making it real doom and gloom for things like mackerel and cod. But actually, stocks of mackerel in the North Atlantic are higher than ever at the moment. And so it's, and to say that they're only an 86% of what they should be in the North Sea 10 years ago is being a bit emotive about it in terms of picking a figure that perhaps is swaying it one way. Do you think?
Well,
And similarly,
the
cod.
question of emotive.
Yeah,
The question of emotive. I'm trying to leave the emotive side out of it. I'm trying to look at things factual. This is, of course, just the North Sea, right? When you go to other seas, the English Channel, the Irish Sea, Bay of Biscay, Arctic Sea, and so forth, you'll have a different set of figures and circumstance. So this is just one place over one time. Now, the question I think you also need to ask yourself is what's caused that? Because if haddock is not to end up in the same state as cod and other stocks, what has got to happen to prevent that? Because if cod is overfished, as you can see it is, the pressure is going to be on the stocks which are still abundant to be fished, because as was made earlier on, there's an economic issue there, and if we take a wider look at the global picture, many communities around the world are based on fishing, particularly in coastal states. It's central to their economy, and these are a very important issue. So they can't readily give up fishing in the same way as our fishing communities and other in the European Union also argue that they don't want to be obliterated. They don't want to disappear like the car industry did in this country, or whichever industry you refer to. They want to have a future. So we've got to look at the questions of how that future is actually sustainably managed. The one other point about these mackerel, which is arguably being more sustainably managed now, is what actually is the level of the stock. Because one of the issues that came up in the Common Fisheries Policy reform back in 2012 was the idea that you can fish sustainably to what is known as the maximum sustainable yield. So the scientists take a figure for the stock and say, right, you can take out of that stock X number of tons per year and leave sufficient breeding stock for that to regenerate to enable you to take another X quantity of tons the year after, maximum sustainable yield. And so they've been trying to set quotas based on this concept of a maximum sustainable yield. But there is one difficulty with that, apart from working out what a maximum sustainable yield is that when you start setting it for these stocks, these stocks that have been heavily overfished, the stock compared to historic terms is a fraction of what it is. Today is a fraction of what it was. So maximally sustainably fishing a very depressed level is virtually keeping that stock at that very depressed level. It's not actually allowing it to rebuild to its historic level, which would in fact, if it were to happen, produce a much more abundant fishery, both in terms economically and in terms of food. So maximum sustainable yield is a useful tool, but it's keeping the stocks at this very depressed level. And that's one of the weaknesses in the common fisheries policy reform. So although mackerel is coming back, for example, to be more abundant, it's still, in historic terms, extremely depressed. What are the factors, does anyone think, that has caused this situation to come about? Because fishermen have an eye to maintaining their future. Governments, pardon?
It's what the public want to eat. Like, cod is always going to be the fish and chips. So it's going to be fish for more. And it's trying to get people's perception to go across to other white fish. Like, if you were to up the quota of haddock and reduce the quota of cod, you could start levelling them out, potentially.
Here we are, reasons for change. In other words, read why have the stocks fallen? Now, in 1880, most vessels were sail, powered by sail. So when you hauled in a net, you had your own body strength alone. There was no mechanical, motorised ability available to you. But around 1880, that started to be introduced and has been progressively introduced. So when you bring in motor engines into a ship, and you can have mechanical capstans, you are able to use much larger nets because you've got mechanical means to draw in the catch. So that's one reason. Next is that leads to the use of larger nets, which obviously means that you can catch more fish. You've also got increased days at sea because the means of staying at sea and the size of the ships and the general ability to stay at sea has improved. So fishing capacity expands for that. You've also got onboard refrigeration, so you don't immediately have to come back to port to land your fish, but you can store it. And if you see some of these programs on television, you'll see how they're refrigerated in ice. And very importantly, you've now got sonar, which enables a captain of a fishing vessel to very precisely locate where the stocks are in the sea, and thus deploy his nets to the greatest potential. So all of those are leading to increased fishing pressure. And really, in a sense, they're sort of irreversible trends. You would never want to undo any of those things. Small boat fishermen is being virtually eliminated. And it's large companies with large vessels deploying large nets that can stay out at sea for a very large period of time that are the operators, whereas back in 1880 it was a mass of small individual fish. And it's said, for example, that in the port of Lowestoft on the east coast, the harbour there was so full of small boats that you could actually walk from one side of the harbour to the other by just walking from one boat to the other.